Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in again. As you may have noticed, although I've put the synthesizers on the side for a while, I've come back to them. And I'm also chatting to some of my buddies back in the home country there, in the old country. And that's why I put up my little video about the ring modulators. Just trying to explain something we discussed using the actual synth as the example. So as for today, I'm going to tell a little story, and this little story is how they developed the modern synthesizer. First the modular synth, and then the minimoog, the common portable synth back in the day. Short version. Okay, let me set the stage. It's 1955. If you're in a rock band, your only choice of a keyboard is an organ. That's pretty much the only thing that's portable and easy enough to drag to a show. And of course, an organ can play more than one note. It's got some variety. If you got a Hammond, maybe you can pull the drawbars up and down to change the sound a bit, or pump it into a Leslie cabinet. That's cool too. But sonically, it's kind of limited. And in the guitar world, they're getting more sounds. They're getting delay, reverb, distortion. Some of those aren't easily available in a pedal like today, but they can definitely do it in the studio. So records are coming out that have a little bit of slapback delay, that have reverb, and have distortion. So there's also people in 1955 who want to make electronic music. If you want to do that, you have to go to a studio. An electronic studio back in the day was kind of like a computer in the sense that it filled an entire room. Many electronic music studios were filled with oscillators, tape decks, and other equipment. Although a lot of it might not have actually been designed to make music. The oscillator might have been something left over from World War II surplus stock. I think they used tone generating equipment to guide bombs in bombers back in the day. Anyway, oscillators have lots of other functions. They would have been used to test a telephone system which was in place since the 20s or 30s. So oscillators are definitely available. Tape decks that you can cut and splice sounds are available. Other stuff, you might be able to get a tech to build something for you, or find an unusual piece of equipment which is used in some kind of laboratory setting. But it's not sold as music-making gear. It's repurposed as music-making gear. Okay, so in 1955, we got this kid. He's about 20 years old. His name is Bob Moog, M-O-O-G. And for the last 5 years, he's been building theremins and theremin kits in his dad's workshop. So a theremin is an instrument that lets a human hand control volume and pitch in 2 dimensions. If you wave it one way, it gets louder or quieter. If you wave your hand the other way, the pitch goes up or down. I'm not going to get too deep into how exactly a theremin creates a sound, but its sound is kind of simplistic. In the modern world, we could basically represent that by plugging a sine wave into a volume control. Let's listen to the sound of a sine wave for a moment. It has no harmonics or overtones, so it's often described as a pure sound. It's also similar to a flute. Okay, so that's the theremin. It's certainly quite a visually interesting instrument, although sound-wise it's kind of limited. So Bob is in the engineering community, and he likes to go to trade shows and stuff, and eventually he meets a guy named Herb Deutsch, I think is how you pronounce it. So Herb is a musician, and he's an amateur electronic musician. He owns a theremin, he owns a tape deck, and he owns a square wave oscillator. So at home, he can make a weird sound on the theremin and record that, and he can make a square wave sound on his oscillator and record that, and patch those, splice those tapes together to make something. He can do a little bit of limited overdubbing, but what he wishes is that he had a portable box that he could bring to a gig, to a live show, sort of like the electronic studio that takes up a whole room. except this would be portable. That's the key difference. So he and Bob talk a lot. Bob builds him a device. The device is much like what I just patched together on my synth. It's an oscillator running into a VCA, which is an amplifier or a volume controller. However, Bob takes a second oscillator, and instead of tuning it into the audio pitch range that we can hear, he tunes it way down. In the modern synth world, we would call this a low-frequency oscillator because it's tuned low and is usually called an LFO. So here's where Bob is quite smart. The LFO is not outputting a sound that anyone can hear, but it is outputting a voltage. So first, he uses this voltage to control the volume of the amplifier, and he gets an effect called tremolo. Later, he uses the low-frequency oscillator to control the pitch of the audible oscillator, and that gives you something called vibrato. So let's listen first to tremolo and later to vibrato. So Bob has come up with something we call voltage control. This isn't something he invented, but it's probably one of the first times or the earliest times it was applied for musical purposes. Maybe not the only time, but this concept wasn't widely accepted or used. And most of what I've said so far is in the history books, but I just want to throw in some of my own analysis here for a second. Remember how I said the theremin player could control the volume with his hand in one direction and the pitch with his hand in the other? Vibrato and tremolo are therefore the two forms of expressiveness that he could actually integrate into his playing. He could make the volume wobble a little bit, or he could make the pitch wobble a little bit. And I guess what I'm saying here is Bob had built so many theremins, so when he thought of musical expressiveness, he used that LFO to duplicate that same function that a theremin player who had great skill would have done. Okay, there's another important difference between the theremin and Bob's device, which is that Bob's device can choose from different waveforms that the oscillator can produce. As I said, the theremin generally sounds like a sine wave, which is sort of thin and hollow, a little bit like a flute. But even before Bob was working on his development, there were already different kind of oscillators that existed on the market. I said that Herb had an oscillator which was a square wave, which makes a kind of hollow sound, you could say similar to a clarinet or an oboe. And Bob's oscillator could also produce a sawtooth, which is quite buzzy, and it could produce a triangle wave, which is like a sine wave, but only a little bit buzzier. So by giving you different choices in the oscillator part of the circuit, Bob is already going away from the theremin's sound and giving Herb different options to choose from before he even applies the other parts of the circuit. Let's listen to a sine wave again, then a square wave, then a sawtooth. Okay, so just to recap here, Bob has built this little box. It's not even a finished device. It's like a breadboard, meaning it's an open circuit that he can keep tinkering with. And he's developed this concept of voltage control to adjust the parameters of the circuits in real time with the goal of musical expressiveness. Okay, so Bob and Herb together take their little device around to various conferences and universities. According to the history books, again, he visited Toronto in Canada, and someone advised him to put a filter into the circuit between the oscillator and the amplifier. Now, if you look at the circuit diagram for a theremin, you can see they do have filters in this position, but these filters were basically fixed. You couldn't adjust them in real time for any musical effect. But because Bob has developed this idea of control voltage, he can also change the filter position, he can open it or close it, and he can also change the filter's resonance, which is also called feedback. This is a typical sound you've heard if you've ever heard electronic music. It sounds like this. Okay, wow, now control voltage has gone beyond just vibrato and tremolo, those established expressive concepts. Now we're into new territory here. And by the way, Bob and Herb, through experimentation, they quickly realized that the filter sounds better on some waveforms than others. I'm not going to get into the physics, but due to how a sine wave is formed, a filter wouldn't affect its sound very much, but it absolutely affects the sound of buzzier waves such as the sawtooth, the square, and the triangle. So it has quite a powerful musical effect, which Bob and Herb realize the advantages of. So Herb is still playing around with the box. He's loving it. He says, Bob, I want to be able to trigger the envelope to open it without rewiring the control voltage into it, because we're already using the LFO for something else. Bob says, run across the street, buy a doorbell. Herb buys one for 35 cents. They wire it in, and now they can play a single note by pressing this button. But of course, that's only open or closed. Actually, an organ kind of works this way. When you play an organ key, you hear sound. When you stop playing, the sound stops. But that's kind of a limited expression. Many instruments sound, well, they sound more complex than that. So Bob is actually a university student at this time. He's heard that they have one of those big room-sized studios on the campus, and there's a famous prof and composer there. His last name is Usachevsky, and that guy has been known to work in those studios, and he knows how all the gear works. Bob was so far outside of the electronic music scene that it never even occurred to him to visit one of those studios, but now that his box is in development with Herb, he runs on over and finds Usachevsky, and they chat about it. So Bob was originally thinking of developing, rather than just the on-off of the doorbell, he was going to develop a two-stage envelope, which in the modern world we'd call AR, attack and release, and that might control the VCA, the amplifier, tell it when to open a little bit more smoothly and close a little more smoothly. Usachevsky says that's a good idea, it's a good start, but he's been poking around in the giant studio for a while, and they have envelope generators there. Usachevsky advises him to make it an ADSR instead, a 4-stage envelope that lets you control first how quickly the sound begins, and it's the D is for its first decay time. The S is for sustain, or how high or how loud the sound will be as the key is held. And then as soon as you release the key, how quickly or slowly it reduces back to zero. Usachevsky has been analyzing what real-world instruments look like when they're recorded to tape. And if he wants to imitate that response, he's realized that an ADSR is more useful. Since in his big fancy studio, he could wire two ARs together to make an ADSR, so he would have seen and experimented with the advantages of that. So Bob takes his advice. He attaches a simple keyboard, so every time you play one note on the keyboard, it sends two different control voltages to the system. One is to trigger the ADSR to allow the sound to pass through, and in that sense, every key transmits the same voltage. It says, start the ADSR now. In the modern world, we'd call that a gate, like opening a little door to start the process. However, the other notes on the keyboard have to transmit a different voltage to the oscillator. Each pitch, C, C sharp, or D, needs its own voltage. So Bob has to come up with a system that says how many volts will turn into, what distance between notes, what interval on the musical scale. The system he came up with is called 1 volt per octave. There's other systems you could use, but that's the one he came up with. And so now Herb can play melodies on the little box. When he presses a key, he hears a note. When he presses a second key, he hears another note at a different pitch. And each time he plays a note, that sound that he hears can be more complex than just the simplistic sort of sine wave type sound of the theremin. It can actually sound more complex due to the control voltage. So they've done it. This is it. This is what we, in the modern world, we call subtractive synthesis. It got this name because the original oscillator is packed full of many overtones, but when the filter closes, it cuts out some of those overtones or removes them or subtracts them. So this method was given the name subtractive synthesis. As I said, this development went on in around 55 or 56. For the next 10 to 12 years, Bob started building large boxes, modular synths, which had various combinations of oscillators, filters, envelopes, and amplifiers, as well as other more complex modules, which we're not going to get into today. He went on to sell those to rich and professional musicians or to schools that wanted to teach synthesis to their students, but one of them would cost you about as much as a house at the time, so it wasn't exactly affordable. Technically, the smallest systems would have been portable enough to get them to a gig, but there was complications with that. They could drift out of tune. It wasn't really an instrument that lent itself to life on the road. So let's jump forward 12 years later. Sales are flagging. Most of the musicians or schools that Bob could contact, especially in the United States, have already bought what they're going to buy. And from a high of selling maybe 10 systems a month, they've now dropped to about 1 a month. And they're building them at this little factory in Bob's hometown. But, everybody can see the writing is on the wall. The business isn't doing very well. So some of the engineers who are now working for Bob had pitched to him the idea, similar, if you think about it, to what Herb was pitching, of a small musical instrument, everything in one box that you could take to a show and play. And history has some disputes here, but basically Bob wasn't a huge fan of the idea. So they waited until he went on vacation, and one guy scrounged up some leftover parts from previously made products, and he put it all into a little box with a keyboard. And the design was very similar to the one we've just described, except instead of one oscillator or one LFO, it actually had 3 oscillators that would be fed into a mixer and then into the filter. But you could detach the 3rd oscillator from the audio channel and use it as an LFO, just like in the original little box that Bob built for Herb. So, very, very similar thing. And Bob came back from vacation, and they showed him what they'd made. And at first, he was a little bit pissed off that they had gone against his advice. After all, he's the man. He built the first box. But eventually, he came to see the wisdom of it, and they sent it through some prototyping. They changed the faceplate so that instead of using cables to connect one module to another, as you saw me do today, they put that all behind the panel and made the connections permanent, so you couldn't really change them too much. But they gave you lots of knobs so you could adjust the sound yourself, and they designed it in a little case so you could put the lid on it and carry it like a suitcase to your gig. and what they'd invented was the minimoog. They went through some prototypes, and the Model D was the main commercial product. Something that sold extremely well. It was the first synth to be sold in music shops alongside guitars and basses and amps, and it really changed the face of music in many fields, not just rock and roll, but also jazz, funk. I could go on. Anyway, yeah, that's the history of how they did it. It's neat to be able to use a modular synth to recreate some of those simple sounds and show the process of how they got to where they were going. And it's been kind of a long video for me here. I hope you found this interesting. If you want to read more about this, you can find a book called Analog Days, where they tell this story in more detail. But yeah, I've tried to keep it as factually accurate as possible. It's actually my second time recording this video because I wanted to get the details right. So yeah, I hope you found this interesting, and tune in next time, especially if you want to hear more bleepy bloopy modular sounds. I'm going to make some more of those. Cheers. Peace.